academic time, ways to leverage technology to improve access to evidence-based care. After graduating, I was on the tenure track for about 4 years. So I was researching, teaching, and also still practicing 1 day a week on the side when a friend approached me about transitioning into industry. And so at first, I was like, no, this is the dream. I'm a tenure track professor. That's what I came here to do. And I was resistant to the idea at first, but she was able to persuade me over time by helping me to understand the real scale that I would be able to impact working for a tech company, and how much greater that was than what I was able to do by myself with, a small team of research assistants. So she was successful in convincing me, and I joined Pear Therapeutics as my first position. And so Pear Therapeutics is the first company to bring prescription digital therapeutics to market. Their primary products are for substance use disorder and opioid use disorder, and more recently they had a product for chronic insomnia. So I was a medical science liaison. I'll be happy to tell you more about that role and what that entails later. I think it's a little bit non-traditional from what we typically see represented in therapists in tech. And so I was there in medical affairs is the like organization or department that it's called. Pharma companies, biotech companies often have those departments. And after about 2 years, I left and transitioned into my role now at Happify Health. And so here I am Director of Precision Innovation, Strategy, and Operations. And so my role is quite diverse in what I do on a day-to-day basis. But I'd be happy to tell you more about that as well. So with that, Sharon, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon. This is probably one of my favorite things to do is trying to demystify this process of transitioning into tech and industry, because not too long ago I was in the very same shoes that you all are. And my background is also as a Ph.D. in clinical psychology. A lot of my expertise in the specialty area has all been in working with kids and adolescents. And it was probably around the time that, I kind of always knew that like academia and research only was not going to be a path for me. I just didn't know what that might look like. I knew that I really liked the translation process for taking like, someone else who did all of the PI work and research methods, and then they churn out the results, and taking that and trying to apply it into day-to-day, life experience. And so maybe like halfway through grad school, that was when I hit a really jaded phase of, what exactly are we doing here? Like one person, and maybe my mom, has read the paper that I just spent like 3 years trying to publish. This doesn't make any sense. There has to be a better way. And then eventually when I was on internship, I was here in the Bay Area, and I started learning about all of these startups that were focusing on, at the time they called it wellness, specifically employee wellness. They weren't calling it mental health. But very clearly, you would look at their websites and you're like, you're definitely doing mental health stuff. And it floored me that there were not clinical people. And I was so confused, because I was like, wait a minute, these companies are getting buttloads of money and they don't have clinicians. Like I was so confused. And the only thing that I knew at that point was these companies are totally going to move without the input of clinicians if we don't try and join in, and try and find the companies that are willing and very much putting, having a seat for clinical voices at the table. So from there, I just started basically putting my name out there. There are a lot of people who are part of the therapists in tech community that I completely cold emailed, and they were more than willing to basically kind of help mentor me and pass along a lot of different opportunities. And it was really from there that I started, that was like my transition point. So prior to my role at Modern Health Now, which I started about maybe 6 months ago, I was in a tenure track, kind of traditional academic professor position. So I'm happy to talk about that transition. Back over to Terrence.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Alyssa. I'd like to now just open up the forum to questions from our audience. Again, you may unmute yourselves at any point if you want to ask your questions or make comments aloud, or you can also mention them in the chat and I'll just read them aloud, but however everyone feels comfortable.
I can start with a question if no one else wants to jump in. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can
Yes.
hear you. Thanks,
Okay,
Ben.
cool. Hi, my name is Ben Corbin. I am from New York City. I was curious specifically at Sharon's comment, but also Alyssa, this certainly applies to your experience as well. Sharon, you had mentioned this dichotomy between having a clinical background and working in as to use your term, a business with a buttload of money trying to make profit, right? So I'm curious to know about maybe some of your experiences around that. This is a business and this is a wellness and mental health oriented business. Where the conflict lies there, and how you, with a clinical background, might have had challenges in that, have had successes in that. A broad question, but hopefully it can at least start the dialogue.
Yeah, for sure. What a great question. I think this is something that we think a lot about in therapists and tech. And it's probably one of the biggest learning curves I've had when it comes to understanding that the company that you are working for, if you go into tech and industry, is ultimately a business. And at the same time, there are like places where in our, like, as clinicians, we also have private practices that operate like a business. They are a business, right? And we derive our income from there too. And of course there are differences when it's a type of scalability where you're talking about trying to get mental health in the hands of like millions of people. That's very different from like the one-on-one care that you're providing, and from like a private practice standpoint. So I will say that as far as some of the areas of conflicts, it's really that push and pull between trying to balance something like quality, really, really high quality care that that you're able to do when you're sitting one-on-one with somebody, and then the challenge of increasing access. So that, like, I think that's the dichotomy that like exists, of like the rush of trying to push out like more and more and more, and scalability, which is also a really I think important value and mission, while also maintaining quality. So I'd also be interested, Alyssa, what your experience has been there.
Yeah, I'd echo what you said, but another thing that I was thinking about too while you were talking is there are different levels of regulation in the digital therapeutic space specifically. So everything from FDA market authorized or market cleared digital therapeutics. There's a sort of middle road called enforcement discretion products, and then completely just sort of unregulated in the wellness space. And so sometimes companies make decisions that maybe are inconsistent with our sort of like personal missions and preferences as providers who want to increase access, but somewhat counterintuitively could potentially lead to more access. So one of the examples I can give you is prescription digital therapeutics. At both companies I've worked for have had prescription digital therapeutics. This may be the first time you're hearing that term. Essentially what it means is that the therapeutic needs to be prescribed by a prescriber. And so in most jurisdictions, that precludes psychologists from prescribing CBT focused digital therapeutics. So I think many of us probably have a fundamental issue with that. Count me among your ranks. We're working on that. But one of the reasons for that is because per the FDA, you cannot make marketing claims that you treat a diagnosis unless you have market clearance or market authorization. So you're limited in what you can advertise and what you can communicate to people. And so if you don't have market clearance, people in some instances could end up being confused, like, what exactly is this? Can it? It says depression, but doesn't say treats depression. What does that actually mean? And it also has implications for reimbursement. And so for me, there's been a lot of push and pull around this issue in particular, because if we can get things covered by people's insurance, that improves access, right? And yet, sort of counterintuitively, there's some additional barriers because now there's this extra step for them to get access. So it's an interesting problem, and one that I think many companies are trying to be thoughtful about and work with regulatory bodies to try to come to sort of a medium that is a compromise.
Thank you, Alyssa and Sharon. We have a few questions coming in through the chat, so I'm just going to go in order of what was received. I have one question from Dan here. What are the biggest needs for tech companies internally that therapists can help contribute? What are the transferable skills for mental health professionals?
I honestly think that we can contribute everywhere. And, obviously I'm a little bit biased, but I've had very different roles. I've been in the commercial organization, which is where I sit now at Happify. I've been in the medical affairs organization. I have peers who are in the research organizations. I have peers who are in product organizations. And so really there's not many areas of these companies where we wouldn't fit. It's just what you want to do, what your particular background influences and gives you skill sets to use. But the opportunities are, I think, essentially endless. And because so many companies are building, scaling, my position, for example, was designed specifically for me. They took the background and experiences that I had. I'd originally applied to interview for a research position. And they said, well, given that you've done X, Y, Z, would you be interested in working with our commercial team on strategy? Because we don't have a voice from someone who has been a practitioner or a researcher, and you could help sort of the business side of things with the clinical perspective. So I think the opportunities really are limitless. I honestly believe that breaking into industry in your first role is the key thing. I've been approached for many different roles in many different areas since I got that first job. So my general thought about this is get in where you can that makes the most sense based on your experiences and interests. And then once you're in, I think it's much easier to move around and be more selective about what you want to do.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the same boat as Alyssa, feeling that therapy, I mean, we're just a joy to work with. Most of us are very good at active listening, identifying problems, trying to create active solutions. And as far as, and also just like the knowledge clinically, and also if you have research experience, I think being able to really critically examine those things are transferable skills. For me, I remember trying to understand the industry and what roles existed so that I could better assess what skills do I have right now that then will translate and transfer. That was really hard because there's not, this would actually be a great Medium article to identify the different areas within tech companies where clinicians often are. I think now there are big enough companies where you can go and see what you can glean from. I know not many people are posting their structures, but you can kind of look on LinkedIn and say, this person has the same clinical background that I do. Would I be able to somehow connect with them? But largely, it was starting to understand that there are these different teams that clinicians can fit under. So there's and Alyssa, you can help me with this. There's clinical operations, which might look a little bit more like what a clinical director role could be. There's clinical product and content as well. So that's creating, that was actually one of my favorite areas. So that's a lot of translating what we know in the research to then something that is going to be really accessible and immediately usable by members or clients and things like that. there's obviously also, if you want to practice clinically, I've seen some people practice clinically with these digital mental health startups and then go ahead and apply, so like that's their in. So they get used to the product and then they end up discovering like, wow, like XYZ could be a lot better. And they're starting to make suggestions and then, they end up applying for a position. And it also depends, I think the other factor kind of to throw in here is the stage of the company. So depending on the stage of the company, you may end up, if it's really early stage and you join, you may end up being the person who ultimately is doing all of these things clinically, rather than, more specific within that. But I think one of the best ways that I started learning about these different roles was just trying them on in different consulting opportunities. And yeah, I feel like I didn't totally answer the question.
I think you answered. I'm sorry if I just jumped in. I think Alyssa or maybe Sharon said something that made me think. So I'm actually on the other side of this conversation. I left a job at Google. I'm starting my second mental health company. So, I feel pretty experienced, but obviously not as experienced as any of you in the domain. Because we're so early and our first hire will be that kind of director, psychologist role that you're talking about, are there any do's and don'ts? I'm sure it sounds like, Alyssa, you mentioned some horror stories, but because we have this opportunity, do you have any frameworks or tips of best case scenario, this is how you onboard that individual?
Essentially to get this, a person who has more of a mental health and clinical background, up to speed into tech and industry?
Up to speed, yeah, if that's kind of the main friction, or just generally building a healthy relationship and company that you have kind of that blue sky space.
That's a good question, and I wish I had a good concrete answer to offer you, but I don't. I think one thing that is important is to give folks time just to sort of transition to the tech space. I learned so much my first year just by listening, just by sitting in meetings that may or may not have even been relevant to my direct role, but just being able to listen and understand the way that people thought and planned and strategized, because honestly, it's radically different from the way I thought as a researcher, clinician, and teacher, So I think any opportunity for people to do that is helpful. Something I've been doing with my team that I hire is I try to get them immersed in some relevant conferences, just so again they can absorb, be in sort of the environment and understand the way people talk, the way people think, the way that they approach things. So again, I'm specifically in digital therapeutics as opposed to mental health more broadly, but I will send my direct reports to DTX East or DTX West, whichever one is coming up next, so that they can get a crash course in sort of the state of what's happening. Something for me that was an adjustment was there are a lot of these commercial conferences that are different than academic conferences, which I was used to attending as a researcher and clinician. So I think sort of helping people to understand what the purpose of these conferences are, what they'd be able to learn from going, and immersing them in the language, the culture. I personally think that that's a helpful thing to do.
Yeah, and then I think what's coming to mind for me is kind of tying in from the previous question on transferable skills. So one of the things so depending on the discipline, so from if you're talking about counseling psychology versus clinical psychology versus social work, there are, we have various opportunities to work in a multidisciplinary fashion, and that's basically the equivalent over in tech and industry is cross-functional partners and cross-functional collaborations. So we're already doing that very well. And so if you find somebody who's been in various settings, they'll be more accustomed to being able to switch to that. And then the other thing to note too is that I think depending on background as well, we do tend to be really good systems level thinkers, and that's helpful for starting to get an idea of how exactly are all these cogs moving together, and then somehow creating a deliverable or something like that. So I think those are some of the skills that maybe I'd look for. And then in the transition process, I agree with Alyssa. I think sitting in on meetings that you're not even sure if you should be there was really helpful for me to start getting an understanding of that systems level. I'd also say that it's been most of the times, like I'd say that for clinicians coming in, we're very good at picking up, because we do this with clients, we're very good at starting to use the language that the person we're speaking to is using. We begin to use their terms, but in my experience, cross-functional partners don't do that. Right. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but so there's a ton of jargon and you're trying to wade through what exactly are you speaking to? So there is this like language translation period, just to like be aware of, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was VA trained, and for those of you who did any work with the VA, you understand like the alphabet soup of acronyms that are thrown at you constantly, and it's a little bit like that. Just the jargon and like the language people use. Like I jokingly slacked a friend one day, like if I hear the word alignment one more time, my head is gonna explode. There's just like certain words and phrases, and that's just completely different, and it does take some time to sort of start to think the way that they do.
Thank you for that. I'm moving on in order of our other questions here in the chat. Julie asks, there seems to be different categories of professional opportunities for clinicians, research, strategy, operation, and clinical care. Would you explain your thoughts about understanding the different categories of roles and how to find a good fit?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of what we were speaking to before. I mean, I think for the last part of the question, so finding a good fit, what helps me was starting with where's my intersection of skills that I know I'm very good at, skills that I'd like to cultivate, and like an area of like passion, I guess. So like that kind of conglomeration. And then from there, I think you can better communicate. So like in understanding the categories of roles, I think in TNT, everyone has like little descriptors, or you can find on LinkedIn, people who hold all these different categories of roles that you've listed here. So then in reaching out with them and just setting up, some very quick coffee chats, learning more about what exactly it is that their day-to-day looks like. And then you can kind of, from that point on, I remember when I was trying to find a position, people were asking me, what are the things that you're looking for? And I couldn't tell them a term, but I just described the skill set that I really, that I felt like I had, and the interests and the things I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and I think that's really good advice, Sharon, because in my experience, different companies call things different things, right? Or they split them out into different departments. Like at the company I'm at right now, in my last one, clinical operations is under research, and they actually do not oversee anything clinically related, but rather they are study coordinators and things of that nature. So it's not at all helpful, but the language is completely unstandardized. So I think it's really good advice, Sharon, to think about your skills, your interests, what you'd like to do day to day, and sort of go from there.
Thank you. I have a question here asking, what do you feel was the game changer that allowed you to land your first job in tech? Or how did you get your foot in the door?
This is really unhelpful. I'm very aware of that, but I just got lucky that a friend had made the transition into tech and saw something in me and my skills and my interests and reached out to me. I should add that my research area was in substance use during my grad work and most of my tenure track time. And there was this, brand new company that had a product focused on substance use disorders. And so she reached out to me because she knew of my expertise. So again, I realize it's really unhelpful in the broad sense, but in trying to translate it into tidbits that are useful, use therapists in tech to network, to meet new people, to know what folks are up to, where they're working, what their roles are, because you never know sort of what sort of connections people may be able to facilitate. I know I, for one, my favorite part of being a professor was the mentorship, and I miss it immensely. So when somebody messages me on TNT and wants to talk a bit about, what their interests are, where they'd like to go, I personally delight in doing that. And I've, made connections with some of those folks to friends I know who've moved on to other areas that are hiring positions. So I really think, yes, you need skills, but if you're in this chat, you probably already have the skills that you need. Now you need to make connections and find your niche and where you'd be able to fit in.
Yeah, so I think I attempted to try and start answering questions in the chat, and then I was like, this is a bad idea. I can't multitask quite like this. But I'll kind of expand on what I listed there, because I think, to Alyssa's point, it was one of the greatest frustrations to be like, it was serendipity. And I was like, that's not helpful. And there's really not a good path right now. I do think that it's become, like, it's shaping, and therapists in tech is, really helping with that. And so when it came to something like networking, I was also like, I hate networking, or that, just the term. And I think if you take a step back and then, break that down a little bit, it was essentially all I was doing was saying, I want a little bit of experience in tech. Can I just have a conversation with you? Or you're doing something I'm really interested in. As soon as you would then put your name out there and say, this is my area that I really like, these are some of the skills I'm looking for, then the person that you just spoke to will remember that. And there are opportunities that are coming through on their end or within their networks, and then oftentimes they would then follow up. So that was what happened with me. So it's not like these conversations need to be it's like a job interview or something like that. It's just very almost like an informational interview. You're just trying to gather a little bit more, understand what their role might have been, but then also put your name out there. So at least for people who have set up conversations with me, I definitely make a note. I remember that so-and-so is interested in XYZ, this other person is interested in this area, and then as opportunities come along, then I just forward them things. So I think that's like the how-to step of that point.
Thank you. We had actually a question for you, Sharon, about, so I'm just curious how you made the shift from child adolescent focus to modern health.
Oh yeah, sure. So I mean, I definitely it ultimately came down to, I think the role specifically at Modern was asking for someone who was really skilled in measurement and assessment, and basically thinking about it at a global scale, right? So if we're trying to select different clinically validated assessments to stick into our product, how do we then account for the fact that not all of these are validated in the global population? I think we're in over 55 countries. So how do we address that kind of problem? And then on top of that, how do we create a measurement experience, like an assessment experience that is truly therapeutic and collaborative? And because I work with kids and teens, all of my research was in multi-method assessment. So I had a really kind of deep and intimate knowledge with that. And so that's kind of the connection point, but I also really miss working with kids. So I still do a private practice where I'm able to kind of keep up on those skills. And ultimately it came down for me that a lot of the child and adolescent companies that are out there right now are still pretty early stage. And so for me, knowing that this was going to be my first role in tech, I wanted to be able to have a mentorship team that I could go to really support me on the foundational skills that would be necessary, that then I could go off, and once the child and teen companies have kind of grown a little bit, I can take that skill set and apply it there more readily.
Thank you. We had a question here, if it applies to either of you guys, but how did you know that it was time to leave your jobs in mental health profession, whether it's academia or clinical work, and find something new?
I was spending 20 hours on therapists in tech every week. I was like, I think it's really time Yeah, but I think I also at that point it was in the middle of the pandemic. So if you were watching some of the articles that were coming out, it was all about the amount of funding that was going to digital mental health and these startups. And so what you saw was that a bunch of startups were opening up roles for people with our backgrounds. So it was like I was like, I think this is like the time to make the jump. Prior to that, I felt like I didn't have the roles that existed weren't a great fit for me because there were a lot of like clinical research positions, but I was like, I think I need to take a break from research. So, yeah, but now I think there's a expansion from following the pandemic.
I'm going to take a risk here and be completely transparent. I was sitting in a faculty meeting, and they had decided that due to enrollment that was ever lower, we wouldn't be able to get our stepped raise as we were supposed to that year. And what they could offer was a small bonus. And the original sort of proposition was it would be based on your seniority, then others were advocating for equity purposes. It should be all put into a pot and divided equally. This was a difference of about like $100 a person. And we argued about this for 3 hours. And so I just had this moment of like, you know what? There's so much work to be done. I could be helping so many people. And instead, I'm sitting here bickering and like motioning for rules that undo other rules and the faculty assessment thing. And I just had this moment of clarity of like, I need to be focusing my time, or I want to be focusing my time full time on helping people get access to evidence-based treatments. And again, going to be completely vulnerable, put myself out there. I wanted to get paid more money. Okay. Like I felt that the value, my expertise that I had spent 10 years of my life studying and working, I wanted to be compensated fairly and appropriately, and arguing over $100 was not was not doing that. So yeah, I apologize if that was a bit grassy.
Thank you for sharing that, Alyssa. That I really needed to hear that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. I had a question here. In terms of how you achieve success in the later round interviews with tech companies when you're no longer speaking with fellow clinicians and hiring managers, like how do you achieve success in that kind of situation? This person is describing that they oftentimes found that these individuals didn't always know what to ask or what they're looking for.
Okay, first, I think that most of us have a natural skill set where we're able to relate to other people. And that helps set us apart because that is not always the case. I've met lots of other people in, well, I guess I should caveat that I'm realizing that many of you may be interviewing for clinical roles, and so you'd be conceivably interviewing and sort of competing against others who have similar skill sets of active listening and knowing how to make people feel heard, etc. But I do think that in general we tend to be very skilled at that. And so I was just human. I tried to relate to them, ask them about what they loved about where they worked, what they loved about what they were doing, what could maybe use some improvement. And I just tried to connect with them like another, human to human. And it's true, they didn't always know what to ask me and they didn't always relate to my background. But I was able to connect with folks, and some of the feedback I got at one point was someone saying, I don't know anything about her background, but she seems like she'd be a good fit and she knew what she was talking about. So I think we should hire her. So, I think just being a human and demonstrating what you know and what you bring to the table, and being confident in that knowledge and expertise, I think is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, and to kind of follow up on that, I think in the initial question, like if you're able to start off with a question for them, I think a really helpful question is, oh, like when you're looking at cross-functional partners and collaborators, what skills do you really look for? Or like, what does your ideal collaborator look like for somebody with a mental health? So that way you start to hear like, okay, like here are the things that they're going to mention, and I'm going to try and come up with examples of where I've demonstrated that. So that one has been a helpful question. And if, I guess in the past, I've erred on the side of like trying to figure out, depending on what background they come from, trying to see if I can think back to times where I've worked with different disciplines and trying to come up with other examples. So I guess I've relied very heavily on the multidisciplinary work, or I'd call upon like the other like these one-off consulting gigs that I had.
While you were talking, Sharon, it made me think about, so my first role was a medical science liaison, and MSLs broadly are charged with education, both internal and external. So you're responsible for training all the incoming folks on the company's data, on their mechanisms of action of their products. This is a role that's traditionally observed in pharma for pharmaceuticals or in biotech. And the external part has to do with building relationships with who they call key opinion leaders, or I roll my eyes when I say this term now because it means something different, but basically you're trying to find influencers in the field, but we're not talking about Instagram, TikTok influencers, right? We're talking about people who publish a lot, people who are active on like talk show circuits, etc., that have credentials, such as physicians, therapists, etc., and you try to build relationships with them. So I'll never forget, one of the questions I got was like, well, tell me how you are about talking to people who don't really want to talk to you. And I was like, did you see that I'm a psychologist? And so, I think some things that come very naturally to us as therapists are a found skill set. And so finding where to sort of advertise your skills in those areas and match them up can be helpful.
There was a point made earlier in this conversation, but someone had asked, have you found that in making the transition into industry that you're pushed or expected to come in at the bottom of the totem pole, or that your many years of experience are appropriately valued?
Both. So in my first role, that was an individual contributor role, but that role is pretty much exclusively reserved across companies for doctoral level people. So you have to have a Ph.D., a PharmD, some cases an MD in order to qualify for that role. So yes, it was the bottom of the totem pole, but it was a very high point of entry, if you will. In my current role, that my many years of experience are valued, I think, because, again, as I mentioned earlier, the person I work for is a very successful business person who's had several successful startups in the health space, but has not been a healthcare practitioner themselves. And so the years of being a practitioner are highly valued. And I would say that it is not, I came in at a director role, so it was not an entry level position.
Yeah, and for me, I agree with like the both point. So for me, some of my experiences here have come through in the negotiating phase. So, that salary rates connote one aspect of value, and most of the times when a company is coming back like with the offer, it's very clear to me how they will be valuing clinicians as well as the number of years of experience they come in with. So it was definitely, when I was deciding between different companies, it was a factor that I considered heavily, and assumed that because of the type of offer I received, that I'd probably continue to experience like that devaluation after joining. So I decided not to join them.
Thank you for that. This relates to a lot of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, but what are both of your thoughts regarding licensure before transitioning to a tech industry? Do you both find it's helpful? And I'm assuming like this person is probably looking for non-clinical roles.
Yeah, I think it depends on what type of role you're interested in. So I think for me, it was considered an asset in the roles that I was in. It was considered valuable for me to talk to other clinicians, other medical directors, other behavioral health professionals, and be able to say, I'm a licensed psychologist. In research, if you want a research role, I don't think it's necessarily valued or important. And I'm not sure it would have made I'm not sure it would have been a make or break issue for me in either of my roles, but I do think it helped.
Yeah, I agree with Alyssa on those points. I think it's also a matter of just for yourself, if you would really want to be able to do clinical work at some point, in your life. And for some people, that answer is very, very clear. I think after transitioning into tech, if I had to imagine, taking the time out to do requirements for licensure, it would be really hard for me to make that time. And so that's just like a point. And then there are some roles that do require, like some of what I do is like provider quality and management. And so those ones do require a licensure, but they make that pretty clear, like on their job posting. And then it also depends on the extent to which, there are some, if you end up sitting in or being on sales calls and things with customer success, there are some times that, potential customers are just like hearing that, oh, you're licensed, meaning that you've had some kind of exposure experience with seeing clients. And so I think it does kind of depend company to company, how valuable that might be. But you should see it reflected like in the job postings.
Thank you. Someone had asked in the chat, do your teams include other mental health professionals, or are the roles typically more as the lone clinical expert on your team?
So I would say that this one, it depends on the stage of the company. And so earlier stage ones, you probably are going to be one of the lone clinical experts. And so that was something that I was grappling with, because right now at Modern, I do really appreciate that we have a larger clinical team where if there are decisions that need to be made, you feel like it's not like say it's like an ethical dilemma or some sort of like risk management issue. I definitely wouldn't feel comfortable, making that decision solely on my own without some kind of like collaboration or input.
At the first company I was at, there were, I believe, 3 psychologists and 2 LCSWs that were sort of distributed throughout the company. So there were no other clinicians, no other mental health clinicians on my team, but they existed in other roles in the company, some in product, for example, some in research. And at my current company, again, I'm the only mental health clinician on my team, but there are 2 psychiatrists and 3 other psychologists, 1 LPC and 1 LCSW, again, sort of sprinkled throughout the company in different roles. And we meet we have like a clinical task force where we discuss issues like ethical dilemmas, risk, liability, things of that nature. And we meet like once or twice a month and occasionally get special projects that we work more frequently on.
So we've spoken throughout this conversation about skill sets that this group of mental health professionals and trainees can leverage while entering the tech space that are more into clinical skills. Ashley's asking, she's curious if there are specific other skills or hard skills certifications that tech might value that might make you more valuable or marketable in the industry, like product management, agile, so forth.
So I just hired a project manager, and when I got my first batch of sort of pre-screened candidates from HR. They were all people who had a project management certification, and then none of those worked out for various reasons. They tended to be more tech project managers, and I needed somebody with some more sort of like human services sorts of backgrounds. And so I went through and I searched for people with public health backgrounds, counseling backgrounds, etc., and ultimately that is who I ended up hiring. So my answer is it really depends, right? So when HR was doing the screening, they were just pulling people who had PMPs and didn't look at their, specific educational background beyond that. But if you have, say, a fellow clinician as the hiring manager, they may be less concerned about that.
Yeah, so I know that back when I was looking for roles, I was also like, oh my gosh, like, do I have to go back and get a business degree? Like, what am I doing? You definitely don't need to do that. So, but when they were hiring for my role, because it was a clinician that was the hiring manager, they were very like they didn't care if there was tech experience or not. It was a bonus, but it definitely wasn't something they were looking for as far as like hard skills that are specific to tech. Yeah, but I'd say that if you have like a very like specific interest, I don't know if Matt is still on this call, but I was thinking of Matt, like a specific area that you're like very interested in. So like Matt does a lot of design stuff, and he designed our Therapist in Tech logo and everything that you see there. But I don't know, I feel like that was a really good example of someone who's just really passionate about design and picked up the skills. So
yeah, I am still on the call. Hello. I will say though that like in very few of those skills were helpful in one particular context with a previous company that was tech related, but now being at a true tech company at Noon, that is not actually the skill set and expertise that they want from me. Like it's really more the clinical expertise that I find to be where the value is placed, which is interesting.
Yeah, and Matt, while you were talking, I thought about the fact that I do a lot of external presentations, and so being able to throw together a PowerPoint that communicates really complex ideas concisely and clearly, again, a skill that many of us already have, maybe not necessarily a PowerPoint, but from like teaching your clients really complex ideas. Like how many of you ever tried to teach mindfulness to someone who had never heard of it before, So being able to break down complex ideas and make it accessible to people who maybe don't have any background or knowledge in what you're doing is important. And if you can make it look semi-pretty on a PowerPoint slide, I think, at least in the roles I've been, that's been beneficial. Of course, now we send them to like brand people who make them officially snazzy. But just having a good starting point to jump off of, I do think that that's a good skill set to have and to advertise. And in my first role, and this is common for all medical science liaison roles, part of the interview process is giving a presentation, much like you would for like a faculty position. And so again, those presentation skills are really front and center. So again, something that you may not necessarily have a certification in, but you may be able to demonstrate throughout the interview process.
Let's see. We have a question in chat. When we find a position of interest, how do you advise that we proceed? Is it recommended that we apply online or go through the typical application process or network with someone who's in a company or other strategies?
So I would say like now with the Therapist in Tech community growing so much, I've definitely used the Ask channel to be like, hey, does anybody know someone at this company? And chances are there's someone who is. And so then for them to then say, oh, you know what, I know the hiring manager, let me just ping them. And that has been like, I feel like a really, I don't know, a good tool. So that's what I'd recommend.
Yeah, I definitely echo that recommendation. And if that falls short, then going to LinkedIn. I interviewed somebody for a job that I probably would not have interviewed otherwise because she sought me out on LinkedIn, told me why she was excited about working for the company that I work at and why she was excited about the position and the skills that she had. And so, I ruled out people in phone screens because like their answer was basically like, I don't know, because I want a job, and like, so when someone goes out of their way to find me, track me down, introduce themselves to me, and tell me how excited they are, I'm probably going to give them a second look. So if you can't find them through TNT, try LinkedIn. There's a couple other professional organizations you might be able to network through. I know ABCT has like a tech sig. So find someone if you can. Oh, I see in the chat someone said academic Twitter. That's also a good idea. If you can leverage a network, absolutely do it. The other thing I'll add is a lot of these companies offer referral bonuses. So if we refer someone who's hired, we get some cash in exchange for that. And so even if I don't know people that well, if they like make a good case, I'd be willing to put in a referral for them. And I know that there are others who are who do that as well. So even if you just find someone on TNT or LinkedIn and they might be willing to put in a referral, you go right to the top of the pile. People are more willing to give your application a look or a second look. And so don't underestimate the power of just sending someone a message completely unsolicited.
Thank you for that. I see that we have about 4 more minutes for questions. Does anyone else have any last questions or comments that they want to make? I guess I have one last question if I'd like to squeeze this in. So there was a colleague who had suggested that we can try creating our own job opportunities by making a pitch to a company on how we as mental health professionals can be useful to a tech company that doesn't yet have someone with that background. Do either of you have any insights on this?
Yeah, I've definitely seen and heard of these types of things. Like, there, especially when I was doing a little bit more of like some like cold email reach outs, or like if there are companies and startups that I was really interested in, I just loved what they were doing, I loved to look at the website, I would sometimes just reach out and just say, yo, like, I just want to have a conversation. And sometimes it would go in a direction where you're like, wow, like, I really want to work with this person. So that's definitely happened to me on one occasion, and they were like, okay, like, makeup, what role you want. I mean, typically I've seen this happen with really early stage companies, but it's not to say that it wouldn't happen
Yeah,
later.
I was going to say that too. Definitely, I think applicable in early stage. I don't necessarily know in late stage. Yeah, sorry, Sharon, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to echo you on that.
Yeah.
The other thing I will add for like later stage companies, so the company I work at now is Series D, which you may want to immerse yourself in sort of what that means if you're going to cross into this world. But essentially it means that there's been 4 rounds of financing, and most companies go to D or E before they are sort of exited in some way, whether that's by acquisition, whether that's by going public, etc. So generally, the later stage the series, the more employees, and typically the balance shifts from on earlier stage companies, it's higher amounts of equity, lower base salary, and as you move along the continuum, the salary goes up, but the equity typically comes down. But anyways, I'm telling you this because in a Series D, Series E company, things are very tightly regulated. Like, I just submitted our budget for our department. I know exactly how many hires I get this year. I had to justify why I needed each of those hires. And so if somebody came to me at this stage and pitched themselves, there's not a ton of wiggle room unless I had something that was like already somewhat consistent with what they were doing and what their background was. But earlier on, one of my current team members emailed my boss just cold and said, I just moved to the US while I'm waiting for work authorization. I'd love to volunteer for you because of the company's mission. And so she volunteered for a little while and then ended up getting a role created expressly for her based on her skills. So I think, again, like Sharon said, early on, I think that is a possibility. Later stage, I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it's less likely.
All right. Well, I want to thank Dr. Dietz and Dr. Lo again for your time and also our audience for this being a really lively and wonderful discussion. As I put in the chat, our next Fireside Chat is in February. You can sign up with the link over there, and that's going to be talking a little bit more about finding like volunteer opportunities and other opportunities that you can get your foot in the door with working these tech companies. Thank you again for attending for tonight's talk, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. It was nice to talk with you all. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.